So we did Martha Minow, Vengeance and Forgiveness. So in this text, Minow breaks down the ideas of vengeance and forgiveness as well as the category in between, which is retribution. She digs into these three categories, explaining how they work and what role they have in resolving conflicts. She also brings up the idea of truth and justice. She tells us how truth may be necessary for justice, but the two also conflict, which causes the question of which one should be considered more important. Throughout this chapter, she explains how these goals and solutions coincide.
So she starts off by talking about vengeance, and vengeance can be defined as a wronged person seeking their own version of justice. It is an act of punishment towards another that is decided by the single person wronged. Minow defines vengeance as the impulse to retaliate when wrongs are done. Vengeance is not a way to seek social order within a community. They are making a physical and mental effort to harm whoever harmed them. It is solely for the wronged person's benefit. However, vengeance goes a step further than justice and retribution because it can lead to revenge cycles, and the person wronged always seems to do worse than what the person did to them. And then she also goes on to explain in depth that vengeance is synonymous with justice. However, it is an unstable and dangerous form of justice. Yet vengeance can unleash more response than the punishment guided by the rule of law, more even than punishment consistent with the goal of forgiving those who have paid their price or served their time. This is because vengeance is deeply a deeply personal response to being wronged. It can also be about expressing self-respect for oneself. Minow goes on to quote from a philosopher, Geoffrey Murphy, who says, "A person who does not resent moral injuries done to him is almost necessarily a person lacking in self-respect." Yet vengeance, even when understandable, never comes from a moral standpoint. It is a self-centered act in order to get satisfaction for being wronged for feeling wronged by another person. It does nothing to keep the community safe or to keep the peace. And she goes on to talk about different positives and negatives of vengeance. And it seems like the only positive aspect that she talks about is it's very slim to none, usually because it results in more harm and no one is better for it. The only somewhat positive aspect of vengeance that she does talk about is when she references a book she read about a Holocaust survivor. In order to find peace, he killed the doctor who sent his family to the gas chambers. And it quotes, "It didn't bring them back from the dead," replied his inoculator. The survivor answered, "It brought me back from the dead." The survivor believed that the only way for him to start his life over was to right the wrongs of his past. However, what Minow is trying to convey is, who is to know if he ever was better for killing him? Now he has blood on his hands too. And then she talks about the negatives. Minow has more to say on the negative aspects of vengeance than the positive. The act itself is aggressive and out of moral character. It leads people to exact more than necessary, to be maliciously spiteful or dangerously aggressive, or become hateful themselves by committing the reciprocal act of violence. And Minow then references different revenge cycles such as Rwanda and Bosnia, and how revenge can go as far as a societal level leading to mass killings. And it can be applied to better understand Titus Andronicus. Vengeance and its consequences is the central theme of the play Titus Andronicus. The cycle of revenge begins when Tamara makes the decision to get revenge on Titus for murdering her son for a ritual. This decision sets off a domino effect of carnage from both main characters, Tamara and Titus. Both are so keen on getting an eye for an eye that their entire lives are left in ruin because of it. There's no subtlety in their tactics. The revenge cycle begins with murder and rape and ends with cannibalism. Almost every other character of the play, male or female, is caught in their crossfire. This play is trying to show the consequences of vengeance. Despite good intentions to protect and honor family, all Tamara and Titus did was create a bloodbath. It did not better the community, and their actions were a far cry from justice. Vengeance is someone's personal idea of justice when they are wrong, but their downfall is what they need to think of others around them. The hate that vengeance inspires is contagious, and it's demonstrated throughout all of Titus Andronicus.
So the next section she talks about is retribution. And retribution is an act of punishment typically done when a person commits a crime. Retribution is often seen to be more morally correct in comparison to vengeance, as retribution is caused by outrage, not a tactic meaning to harm. Some may describe it as moral reproach, non-reconciliation, a demand of restitution, and in short, any act of holding the wrongdoer to act. This, in a basic sense, means putting things back to an even playing field. Unlike vengeance, retribution doesn't go further, it just gets even. The way Minow describes and speaks about retribution helps make the definition more clear. Minow states, through retribution, the community corrects the wrongdoer's false message and reasserts the truth of a victim's value by inflicting a publicly visible defeat. Here we can see retribution is more about gaining justice through a sort of revenge. In a sense, it carries the motto that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Minow also states that retributive punishment constrains the punishment from degrading or denying the dignity even of the defeated wrongdoer. This further proves that retribution is a more morally respectable way of getting revenge and does have that distinct barrier from vengeance. Next, she goes on and talks about the positives and negatives. On one hand, Minow states that the retribution is morally okay. Retribution could be understood as vengeance curbed by the intervention of someone other than the victim and the principles of proportionality and individual rights. She goes on to state that this motivates punishment out of fairness to those who have been wronged and reflects a belief that wrongdoers deserve blame and punishment in direct proportion. This argument shows how since no one is getting wrongfully harmed or ridiculed and having equal punishment, it seems to be okay. On the other hand, Minow brings up the argument that retribution isn't beneficial because all it does is allow the victim to stoop down to the offender's level. Hampton states, it is no more right when the victim tries to degrade or falsely diminish the wrongdoer than when the wrongdoer originally degraded or falsely diminished the victim. Along with this argument is also the statement of limitation and the fact that people can easily get carried away. This is said to be seen because of the idea that revenge will bring relief and satisfaction will never come. We can see retribution throughout Spanish tragedy. The entire play revolves around the theme of revenge and getting even. There are instances in the play where retribution is pushed too far and passes that threshold into vengeance. However, at its core, the play is about retribution. For example, after Horatio was found hanging from the tree, his father, Hieronimo, vows to revenge on his son's murderers, Lorenzo and Balthazar. This shows after the death of his son sets in, the first thing Hieronimo wants is payback. The scenario is an eye-for-eye situation. Someone killed his son, so now he wants them to be killed. This retribution happens slowly, but in time turns more into an act of vengeance, as Hieronimo wasn't able to control his anger after all the wrongdoing. Most of his killings are under retribution. However, his killings are under retribution. The character revenge is another huge reason why retribution helps understand Spanish tragedy. The character chooses who can get revenge, and revenge is a chaotic character. So for example, retribution is seen as the fair and just option, but the situations rarely seem to come in play as retribution as a conclusion.
So Minow also talks about forgiveness. Forgiveness, by its definition, requires an individual to renounce resentment and avoid the self-destructive effects of holding on to pain, grudges, and victimhood. In other words, it seeks to end the cycle of offense perpetuated by vengeance. And as a result, forgiveness is a response far from vengeance, as Minow states. It requires the ability to seek prevention and reparation in the face of atrocity without causing further harm onto others. Thus, forgiveness is a voluntary and intentional process in which the victim of an offense actively chooses to overcome the negative emotions that can lead to self-destructive behavior. According to Minow, there are many benefits to responding to atrocity with forgiveness, especially for the victims. She emphasizes that forgiveness does not and should not take the place of justice or punishment. Rather, she would argue that forgiveness is not meant to be enacted on its own. It is instead meant to be accompanied by a form of justice or punishment, otherwise it may not have the same effect. Forgiveness, therefore, does not excuse the perpetrator of a crime. They must still receive a form of justice and judgment. Jose Zaliquette, according to Minow, concluded that underneath truth, justice, and forgiveness lie the twin goals of prevention and reparation. In other words, the act of forgiveness discourages or prevents others from perpetrating the same atrocities by displaying vulnerability, and likewise, it allows victims as well as the affected society to begin the healing process. Minow also talks about how there are both positive and negative effects of choosing forgiveness. On one hand, Minow argues that forgiveness can have immense benefits for victims. Through forgiveness, victims can reassert their own power and reestablish their own dignity while teaching wrongdoers the effects of their harmful actions. It offers victims a choice and a sense of control over their situation. Therefore, it is a power held by the victimized, not a right to be claimed. Forgiveness cannot be coerced, instead it needs to be freely given, and in the process it may provide therapeutic benefits. Unfortunately, the practice of forgiveness may produce an exemption from punishment that institutionalizes forgetfulness and thereby sacrifices justice. In other words, a national stance of forgiveness may be used to excuse atrocities and create a general lack of awareness or forgetfulness throughout the nation. Moreover, some institutions may confuse specific acts of deserved forgiveness with a policy of unconditional forgiveness. Thus, the positive effects experienced by victims may be eradicated in attempting to force a policy of forgiveness. Forgiveness may be used to better understand a woman killed with kindness. Near the end of the play, Anne's infidelity is discovered by her husband, Frankfurt, who declares that he will not martyr her. While he admits that his actions may torment her very soul, he does not seek vengeance. Rather, he provides her another home to stay in and servants to tend her needs. In the process, he allows Anne the opportunity to redeem her honor, which she does by fasting. She purges herself of gluttonous desire and thereby restores her virtue. As Frankfurt states, her repentant tears managed to unite their souls once more. As she lay dying, Anne contently remarks that her soul is free due to Frankfurt's forgiveness. Forgiveness, therefore, allowed both Anne and Frankfurt the opportunity for closure, which, in the context of the play, is the best possible outcome.
So we did our case study on Breonna Taylor versus the Louisville Metro Police Department. Breonna Taylor was an EMT and an African-American woman who was fatally shot in her home in Louisville, Kentucky on March 13th, 2020 during a botched police raid. No charges were brought to two of the officers that shot her. However, one officer was charged, but it was not for shooting Taylor, but for wanton endangerment. He shot through a set of blinds which obstructed his line of sight, and this is against police policy. Demonstrations all over the country are continuing to this day demanding true justice for Breonna Taylor because they still believe that it has not happened, which is true. To the left is a picture of Breonna Taylor when I am assuming when she got her license to be an EMT, and then there is a memorial picture of I'm not sure exactly where this memorial is, but there are several throughout the country that they are paying respect to Breonna Taylor. Because of Minow's article, we try to see this through the lens of vengeance. It can be seen two ways in this case. One, vengeance can be seen through the rioting that has occurred in recent events due to hundreds of years of systematic oppression and complete lack of justice. And there comes a point where violence is the only way people think they will be heard, and enough is enough as well. To the escalation of police brutality despite peaceful demonstrations against it, which eventually lead to the rioting, because how did you bring police brutality to the peaceful protest? Questions are, is vengeance a just way to achieve justice for Breonna Taylor? And is vengeance understandable in certain situations? What situations do you think those are? And when does an understandable vengeance go too far?
So we can also see this case respond with retribution, and retribution can be seen a few different ways. So 1, the officers who killed her may be sentenced to a lifetime in prison. 2, extreme reconstruction of the criminal justice system, which may not only make up for her life, but the countless other Black lives that have been lost due to police brutality. And 3, the officers may lose their job without pension and without the ability to be reinstated. So some of the questions that come up with retribution is this enough? And how many lives need to be lost for people to realize that the policing system doesn't work in a fair manner? And how far can retribution go in this case without passing that threshold of vengeance?
We may also choose to respond to this case with forgiveness. Now, obviously, in this case, the victim is not allowed to offer her own forgiveness to the perpetrators of this crime. Thus, it falls to those who are victimized by her loss to choose to forgive the perpetrators. They must relinquish their pain and work to overcome the negative emotions associated with grief that often prompts self-destructive behavior. This will allow these victims to regain the power they lost in the wake of this crime and begin to heal. Forgiveness, therefore, offers the greatest emotional resolution for the victims. Some questions that this prompts, however, is, does forgiveness need to be earned, especially in cases of extreme violence? Is it more important that victims receive closure or that the perpetrators are punished? And is forgiveness possible in the first place when the victim of violence is deceased? So our conclusion here, Minow states that vengeance and forgiveness are marks along the spectrum of human responses to atrocity. She therefore does not offer a definitive answer to how we should respond to atrocities. Instead, we must all grapple with the search for truth, the demand for justice, the urge for retribution, and the call of forgiveness. In other words, our response is ultimately a matter of circumstance. Perhaps we will seek truth over justice. Perhaps we will allow retribution in the place of personal vengeance. Either way, our responses are personal and a matter of perspective. After all, there's something inevitably indeterminate, elusive, and inexplicable about our collective horror, So 2 discussion questions that we would like to pose to the class are as follows. Two questions for forgiveness first are, other than forgiveness, which fits better in woman killed with kindness, vengeance, or retribution, and why? What kind of situations are appropriate for each of these responses, and why do you think that?